Welcome to another program of Judgement Date. We've been doing these programs, as you know, during the lockdown to basically help you through this rather trying process and perhaps to debate issues which to a large degree have been uppermost in people's minds. That's other than the medical questions. And very privileged today to have discussing some of these questions with me, Michelle Le Roux, who is a practicing member of the Johannesburg Bar and is an author. And to put it full disclosure, we have written a couple of books together, the last being Loaf, Adjudication of Politics or whatever it is. I can't even remember the final part of the title, but you'll correct me on that. And to some extent, thinking about writing a third one. So thank you very much for being part of this conversation, Michelle. And let me start off by asking you the following. It seems to me, just paging through Daily Maverick or some of its competitors like News 24 today, one sees, in a sense, a reemergence or a continuation of lawfare in this sense that people dissatisfied with government regulations and the political process, the lack of accountability, are rushing off to the courts yet again. So it seems to me that COVID-19, far from stopping this process, seems to, as it were, have exacerbated. I'd be interested in your view.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me on. Since you've forgotten, let me remind everyone who watches this, the book's called Lawfare, Judging Politics in South Africa. Came out last year.
I've got very old, I can't remember things. Anyway, carry on.
That's why you're at home in quarantine.
Yes.
So the thesis, just to recap, the thesis of that book is that when politics fails, there's a displacement of politics into the courts, and the courts are then asked to adjudicate on political questions. And the thesis in Lawfare, the book, is to say, well, that's an unsustainable political strategy because the courts become isolated, the government will end up packing the courts with executive-minded judges, and what you really need for the constitutional scheme to take, to realize all of the dream and all of the vision is for each and every one of the institutions that are in it to be playing their part and pulling their weight. So obviously, executive, judiciary, legislature, we've seen Parliament perk up with a couple of Zoom meetings, although last night I hear the parliamentary committee got Zoom bombed, and so there was porn all over the feed of Parliament trying to exercise its oversight powers. The judiciary is starting to come back online now in COVID land. So you're having online hearings. I've been, sitting in my study doing online cases, online hearings. And then obviously the executive is where there's now a massive centralization of power. And so the other interesting starting point for me is to say, this is the very essence of seeing how law is the instrument that we use to regulate our lives, to express the political compromise and policies. So, these regulations that are coming out, sometimes withdrawn, amended, changed, within the course of a single day or over the course of a couple of weeks. We all now study the regs to see what it is we're allowed to do. When can you leave the house? For what purpose? Are you an essential worker yet? And you see in these challenges to the regs, the infirmities of law, right? So something like the tobacco ban, for example, everybody's now an expert on whether tobacco is a problem if you've got COVID-19. If it's, the exercise window from 6 to 9 in the morning, everyone is now debating and saying, is this rational? Is it fair? Is this actually too much of an infringement on our rights? So you see this entwining of the political, right? We understand there's a pandemic. We understand lockdown. But now when you come with what people may think are unjustified intrusions, or that things are not as clear as they could be, or quite frankly, when you see police and soldiers murdering people on the streets, the recourse is to the courts. And you see now this proliferation of legal challenges. And it's where that legitimacy in the politics is starting to be questioned, right? Government hasn't articulated sufficiently why it needs to be this way.
So I can get my head around the latter point. The point you make with regard to the policing. I mean, that's obviously a court-orientated procedure, and clearly, if the police has allegedly been the case, and certainly from the documentary evidence in the case, they need to be held accountable by the courts. Absolutely clear. What I'm intrigued about, however, is when we get to regulations which deal with the problematic of COVID-19. Now, I understand that everybody is an expert epidemiologist or virologist. It's extraordinary. Even the other day in the Daily American, there's some actuaries suddenly now experts in epidemiology, which essentially gets you to a point where you want to just scratch your head and say, this can't be. Now, that's the point, that in relation to courts. Now you're asking courts to make very tricky decisions. I mean, these are trickier in some ways than, let's say, the kind of lawfare that we documented in the book, dealing with, let's say, Mr. Zuma and his excesses, or the SABC, Claudie Motsoeneng, or the public protector in the numerous cases dealing with her. Here you're asking judges to make a call on the rationality of decisions whereby lurking in the background is the possibility of significant death if you get it wrong. It seems to me you're really asking a hell of a lot of your judges.
Well, I think I would just say two things in response to that. The one is that I think where the reasoning of government has changed, and so tobacco is the easiest example, right? Where there's been a change of mind, that might be something more ripe for challenge, right? You, at some point, you thought it was okay. Now you've changed your mind. You know, presumably both were evidence-based, both were based on the advice of the experts and the scientists and the doctors. So I think where they've changed their mind on things may be an easier challenge, right? Because you just point to that inconsistency and you point to the rationality of changing it. But I think there's a second point, which is certainly judges, I think, will be deferential, right? They don't want to be the cause of things opening up too quickly with a massive spike, right? You see what's happening in the States, where kind of the red states, the Republican states, are following Donald Trump's let's all open up. And now we're waiting to see what it does to their infection rate. And the expectation is a massive spike. But I think what you're also seeing is, so in addition to judges sitting and saying, well, am I really going to be the person who second guesses something that presumably the government will be able to put up expert advice to justify? I think there's another component to this, which is just practically and procedurally the difficulties of bringing these challenges. You know, the situation is so dynamic and it's changing every day. And the information on the ground, you know, you capture it in an affidavit on day one. By the time, you know, the reply comes in a week later, even in an urgent, the situation may look completely different. So it's also the dynamic nature of how we start understanding the disease, understanding how the lockdown's working, understanding how government's able to respond to the lockdown. Literally, it seems to change day to day, where you see the state succeeding with capacity in some areas, clearly falling down in others. And I think, you know, being unable to sort of stabilize the facts that you're asking the court to look at is another problem. So not only are opinions of experts clearly changing, but that balancing with the facts and what's actually the position. You know, you could imagine that by the time a judge actually looks at the thing, things have already happened on the ground that have overtaken those.
I appreciate that, but it becomes difficult because, you know, if you listen to someone like Jonathan Sumption, the member of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, who probably is, I suppose, to be fair or kind or just accurate, a libertarian of some sort or another.
Yes, it's a description, not a pejorative.
Yeah, well, okay, fair enough. But if someone like that kind of sits in the case, their line is, well, we should open up, you know, these are freedoms that we've got, etc. And what I suppose the point is that whether the courts are the appropriate place for it, there seems to be a structural flaw in this entire design, because the Disaster Management Act, curiously, sort of doesn't really give, other than courts, any level of accountability for what's going on. And it appears that not only can you declare it for 3 months, but you can extend it for a month after month without more. So Parliament, in a sense, has very little role in all of this particular process. And it's a sort of if you had a proper parliament, it would be parliament with accountability mechanisms in parliament that would be very much more helpful. So, and again, we've come back to the problem that absent that, the courts are being asked to do heavy lifting, which perhaps they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, what I find interesting is, because I've had to give some advice on these regulations and I've looked at the Disaster Management Act, it's so clearly and completely explicably, right? It's not a criticism, but it so obviously was drafted with a typical natural disaster in mind. You know, an earthquake in an area, a flood in an area, a forest fire, a bushfire in an area, and that the rest of the country would be functional, operational, able to deploy resources into the disaster zone, and people could be evacuated, responders could come in and address the difficulties. You read that act and you realize like it doesn't really suit when the entire country is your disaster zone, right? The entire economy, every single aspect of life has been stopped. So you see some of that, you see the opportunity therefore for a centralization of power. And it seems, that on certain topics, the securocrats in parliament in cabinet, or even worse, in this National Command Council, a slightly opaque body, to again be generous in the description, opaque body. You see this massive centralization of power in the executive over absolutely every single aspect of life. And then not only is Parliament similarly disabled because of the lockdown and inability to function, but all of the normal processes other than social media have ground to a halt. So it's clearly we should have been in a position to anticipate a pandemic, right? It's been on the set of risks. We've known about it since 1918 and all the other plagues we've seen. But this idea that the entire country and the entire world would come to a grinding halt at the same time is what is so shocking about this particular dislocation and disruption. And I think if you've got authoritarian tendencies, this is heaven, right?
Before you get there, because I want to talk about that, just one question. The logic of your argument, however, which is compelling, that the Disaster Management Act only applies to, let's say, a natural disaster in a particular area, an earthquake or something of that kind, doesn't that then lead you inexorably to the fact that they should have declared a state of emergency, which would have in fact eroded our rights even more?
Well, wait, no, let's be clear what I was saying. I was saying the act is clearly drafted with that type of disaster in mind, not a national disaster. That was my... But
doesn't that mean if you have a national disaster, what you've got to go is for the state of emergency, and that would be a lot more drastic?
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, the Disaster Management Act is clearly coping with, every single portfolio in cabinet is issuing regulations to govern to cover its portfolio. So, I mean, the move to a state of emergency is where you need even more draconian shutdown, even more soldiers on the street. I mean, I have concerns about the logic of the curfew. I have concerns about, we're told that 78,000 or however many thousand soldiers are there to help with food parcels and construction, but you don't hear much reporting about what they're actually up to. So I'm not saying instead we should have had a state of emergency. I don't think we need that much of a limitation, but I'm just saying, in effect, right? If under the guise of the disaster you've imposed a curfew, if under the guise of the disaster, the movement restrictions. Now, again, it goes back to where I started. The legitimacy of using law and the legitimacy of the regulations and how they regulate people's lives depends on the justification and the explanation given by government. So even if we were to open up, people who've been paying attention are unlikely to rush back to a restaurant or their office. So even if you opened up in Sumption's way, I think people who've been paying attention to how this disease works are still going to prefer to work at home, prefer not to socialize, prefer to keep their physical distance. And that's the whole thing. If you know the facts, if you've paid attention to the experts, if your government has explained these are the measures and why, then you can make up your mind for yourself. So if we move to a higher level and I could now go to a restaurant, maybe I still wouldn't feel comfortable. Or maybe I'd only go to a restaurant that had all sorts of measures in place. So it's not about, there's also a respect for the citizenry, right? If you've explained it to me, I'm not an idiot, I can then apply my mind about how much risk I want to take on board.
Yeah, well, that sadly may well be true because the sad reality is, thanks to our appalling neglect and not changing the urban geography of South Africa inherited from apartheid, that the vast majority of our countrymen and women are crammed into townships, cheek and jowl, where in fact social distancing is absurd. And that, in a sense, is a calumny which we have in fact perpetrated ourselves. But let me move on, if I may. You mentioned the authoritarian tendencies. And this is a debate that's now taking place all over the world, which is that it was taking place before COVID-19, but it's clearly much more evident now. And it's a debate that, where do we go from here? And the sense is that two sort of paradigms tend to offer themselves for consideration. One is that a more cosmopolitan international approach, you in a sense hinted at it yourself and saying, this is an international issue. Where have we been all these years? Why can't we do this together? The other is a nationalistic approach, the sort of populism, lunatic populism of Donald Trump, but more than that. And the question I suppose that I therefore have for you is that even in a country like South Africa, now, not even, I mean, there's a lot of debate within the public discourse that securocrats, the word that you used yourself earlier, in a sense seem to be having a really jolly time of it. And that doesn't bode very well for when we come out of COVID-19. When people get used to power, they tend to hold on to it. So what does this say then about the future of constitutional democracy in the light of this debate?
Well, obviously, because I'm a constitutionalist, I'm going to say we double down in our belief that a constitutional democracy is the only way we can go. But it goes back to the starting point of the thesis in lawfare, right? Each institution has to do its bit in order for that to work. Because, when Parliament was not convening, not even online, the executive was happily doing its thing. How much has changed? We might have got a bit more information out of these portfolio briefings. So, for example, Public Enterprises did a briefing last night on the state of the SOEs, where we certainly learned a lot from that presentation, and we wouldn't have known that. But I think it's certainly, I think in every sphere, right? Personally, politically, commercially, everything else, the crisis shows you who you are. And if you're a securocrat who wants the autocracy, and you're willing to sort of gesture at constitutional democracy, but when it comes down to it, you actually quite like these powers, this is the opportunity to be that guy. If you're our president who prefers consultation, social compacting, engaging with all the constituencies and stakeholders and building a consensus on something and whatever, that's how you go through this crisis. So that the choice will still be for each country to make, right? Which option do you prefer? Which type of leadership do you prefer? Which type of government do you prefer? I mean, I think you see each country being a case study in this, right? Those that are not fact-based and are just driven by economics, those that take the science very seriously and have been very cautious. So I think it expresses who you are as a country. I think I saw something online which just was pithy but captured it. It said, we're all in the same storm, we're not all in the same boat. And that's the point here. Someone going through lockdown in an informal settlement is having a very different experience to me in my nice suburban house.
Let me pick that up. So if you look at it, when we come out of COVID-19, it's almost going to expand the problem rather than, in a sense, contract it, by which I mean inequality is likely to grow even worse because people, for example, who run digital companies the world over are going to do fabulously well. They already are. I mean, look at Amazon and companies of that kind. Poorer people who, in a sense, ill-equipped for the digital age are going to be in terrible shape. And so there's going to be an exacerbation of inequality. When you live in a country like ours, which shamefully is the worst in relation to inequality in the world, and we come out of COVID-19 with appalling levels of unemployment and tepid growth, I mean, how surely then on that line of argument, that it is just conducive to an anti-constitutional turn.
Absolutely. So, it's something that anyone who's read the book or come to any of our other events would know that I say often, right? The what you look like still determines what you have in South Africa. What you look like determines how you can weather this lockdown to a large extent in South Africa. Black South Africans are having a very different experience, will be far more vulnerable, are bearing the load of this lockdown and the shutdown in the economy far more than white South Africans. And then it's entrenching and doubling down on that privilege as well, right? So, white South Africans are worried about roast chicken at Woolies when millions and millions of our fellow South Africans don't know if they've got anything to eat today. And then, corruption steals your food parcels. So
exactly. People, not being able to work on the bloody mountain, but that's a small price to pay, one way or the other, compared to what the daily difficulties that people are having right across the country in poorer areas. But that's what worries.
You see this. I think politically, you see this. I think it's starting to come out now, maybe a little in the tussle in cabinet. Every political analyst now is telling us how the EFF support the lockdown because they know it'll drive us even further into economic crisis, and they're the political party with the message that resonates. If you're one of those victims of unemployment, unemployability in an economy that may contract up to 17% on some projections. So, this whole debate about did NDZ undermine Cyril, or are the Securocrats winning? And, now Zuma, Zooming with the Zoomers is now being broadcast from Dubai. So you can see how even in COVID land, the divisive politics that we had before, the race-based politics, the populism, the identity-based politics, which all just runs out, right? It runs out if we can never debate ideas because we stop at what we look like. Obviously, race is critically important to ensure that we redress our past. And obviously, it's the most relevant factor in South Africa. But if we're not using this crisis to say, well, to sound like our finance minister, right? If this crisis isn't what spurs us to make the structural reforms we need, including spatial geography, housing, education, healthcare, all the rest of it. I mean, if we don't use this as a real crucible to finally do what we can do. I mean, the frustration I feel seeing that we can finally get water to people that haven't had water for 25 years. We can finally get desks into classrooms that haven't had desks in classrooms. I mean, if it took a pandemic to deliver, then let's use the crisis.
But if you look at countries that have been are democratic, I mean, entrenchedly democratic, New Zealand, I know it's a small country, and although even though we won the World Cup, it probably still plays the best rugby in the world, but be that as it may.
But it has a female leader. That's the difference.
That's the point. It has a very fine female prime minister, woman prime minister. It's interesting how the women leaders have done better than the men. Angela Merkel being another case in point.
I don't know why you sound surprised.
I'm not surprised by that. I'm just emphasizing it for my male listeners. And it's very important to do that. But if you take countries like that, or Greece, with a very pragmatic prime minister, or South Korea, they've done really well. And one wonders, in a way, you kind of think in those countries which seem to have done so well, it is possible that their democracy will flourish in particular ways. Countries which have not done so well, like Boris Johnson's England or Donald Trump's America, you kind of wonder where they're going to go. And all the tendencies are that if someone like Trump won another 4 years, really authoritarian turn. And so in a country like ours, which is as fragile as ours is for all the reasons we've spoken about, I suppose the question really is, so what are the prospects after COVID-19 finally dampens down? How are we faced to essentially, as it were, ensure that the constitutional democracy that we started 25 to 26 years ago actually flourishes?
I'm gonna give an answer, which is an answer I give about, you know, the lost years, right?
Listen,
we stress tested our constitution, and it survived, and it worked, and the courts worked, and Parliament had moments of oversight, and you know, our free press and our media did a fantastic job at investigating and exposing corruption and venality. You see it. I think there's still signs of all of that today, right? So the resort to courts, the fact that Parliament is up and running again, the fact that the media is reporting on the abuses, whether it's corruption in food parcels or whether it's you know, abuses and assaults and violence and you know, contraventions of protocols on use of force by our security services or the police. I mean, in that sense, I'm going to say, again, we're stress testing our constitution, and I still think it's the best way. It's the best way for us to try to reconstruct our society, but it needs to be done a hell of a lot more urgently. And so the one thing that I think will be great after COVID land is there will no longer be tolerance for government that says it's going to take time. They managed to release spectrum, put water tankers and taps into places, sort out schools and clinics and all the rest of it, things that they haven't been able to do for 2 decades. And I think that urgency is going to now be the standard and the benchmark, right? People are going to be very intolerant if government after COVID says, oh, well, we're going to still have to think, and what about this, and what about that? I mean, the urgency is something that we can certainly harness. And need to keep up the pace.
But that presupposes deliberation, where the government listens to the people rather than